Good
Okie doke, push
afternoon.
the button.
Welcome to the Bob Unger Show. And we have a very special guest today who will educate you. And as a matter of fact, he'll educate me because I know very little about technology, although I do know quite a bit about agendas behind the technology. And my guest is Eric Peters. Eric Peter is a car expert, but he knows a lot more than just cars. From an engineering or technological point of view, he knows about the underlying agendas involved in the cars you're buying right now and all the various options they offer, and how your car can become your worst enemy if you're not aware of this. So it's a very important information you're going to get. And Eric, give us a little bit about your background. Were you always understanding these issues, or did you have an epiphany? And did you evolve in your thinking? And if you did evolve, what was that epiphany and how did it occur?
Well, first, thank you for having me on. It's good to be here. Secondly, it sort of flowed inevitably from my work as a car journalist. I began covering the car industry back in the 90s. It just feels like yesterday, but oh my God, it's been 30 years almost. And in the course of covering cars, you inevitably start to cover mobility, which ties into freedom of movement and mobility. And cars are inextricably linked together. And you'd start to see, or at least I began to see, some of the common threads in these various issues. And rather than consider each one as an isolated and independent thing, I began to tie them all together. And I began to see that there was, in fact, a concerted effort to diminish mobility and to use that to diminish personal freedom in this country. And I think that's why the car is under such strident attack right now. You can see it coming at it from many angles, from use to cost to the regulations that are limiting the choices that are available to people, to this forcing of electric cars onto the market, which really aren't about the electric vehicles. They're being used as the vehicle, in my opinion, to get most of us out of cars by making cars too expensive for most people to be able to own, and by making them too impractical for all of the deplorables who don't live in cities, who live in flyover country, to be able to use.
And did you have any kind of expertise in engineering or technical issues, or did you learn it on your own? Were you an
Well,
autodidact, or did you actually go and get a course somewhere?
I'm something of an autodidact. I've been fiddling with machinery and cars since I was a young kid, and I just have a passion and a love for doing that. And so that gave me insight into the industry, to know the guts, the wheels, and the workings of how these things function. That was just a helpful thing to me in terms of being able to discuss with people intelligently why car A might be preferable than car B for them in their particular context, and what the advantages and disadvantages of various designs are, and also what the impact and effect of government regulations will be on the choices that are available to people. I'm also something of an autodidactical car historian. I love reading about the history of the car, which goes back all the way to the 1870s for those who don't know about this. And at that time, interestingly, it's very curious, the electric car was the dominant player in the early days of the car industry, because at that time they were easier to use, they tended to cost less, they were more accessible to most people, particularly to women and older people, because the first generation of engine powered cars, you had to manually crank them. You had to adjust the carburetor, you had to adjust spark timing, and then you had this transmission to deal with. It was quite a challenge. It was almost like piloting an airplane. But then something happened. Then Henry Ford came along and simplified the car and made the car affordable. And right around the same time, within the same 10-year period, the Kettering self-starter came along, which made it possible to start a car just by pushing a button, just like today. And all of a sudden, cars became easier to use than electric cars, and were more versatile and less expensive. And so, boom, they took over. That was the market in action. Now what we're seeing is an upending or a reversal of that, using government power to force electric cars back onto the market, even though they are more expensive, they're limited in terms of their usefulness. They tether people to a cord, literally. They cause people to spend more money, and so on and so on. So that sort of thing has always interested me. And that's kind of what I spend my time doing.
Okay, well, why are they more expensive? I think I know the answer, but I'd like to hear it from you. And how are they limiting?
Well, of course, they're limiting on a number of levels. They're limiting if you can't afford one. You may like an electric vehicle, but the average price paid for an electric vehicle is about $50,000. That's for an entry-level electric car. And no matter how much you might like an electric car, if you can't afford to spend $50,000 on a car, that limits you, doesn't it? You know, I'd like to own my own private airplane, but I'm limited in that I don't have the resources to buy an airplane. So it's an academic question. So it limits people economically. And it also limits people functionally. The typical electric car has about half the range or less than an otherwise comparable non-electric car. And the reason for that is interesting because the battery, which is a storage device like a gas tank, it holds electricity. It takes about 1,000 pounds of battery to hold the energy equivalent of about 7 gallons of gasoline. And that's why the range of electric cars is what it is. And it's also why electric cars are so expensive. It takes this tremendous battery. Typical electric car battery weighs 800 to 1,000 pounds. Some of them weigh almost 2,000 pounds. For example, the Ford Lightning, which is the electric version of Ford's F-150 pickup truck. The battery in that thing weighs 1,800 pounds. And so what you've got there is a 3-ton, half-ton truck. And think about all the materials that have to be extracted from the earth, including things like lithium and cobalt, and then manufactured and made into a battery. The battery is the single most expensive component of any electric vehicle. It's enormously expensive. Some of these batteries are $15,000 and $20,000 to replace. That's limiting. You own a vehicle, and it doesn't matter what kind of a vehicle, it will depreciate from the moment that you buy it. So after, say, 5 or 6 years, it has depreciated to the point that it's lost, say, 40 or 50% of its original value, right? Now you're looking at potentially, in the case of an electric car, a battery that's getting tired because these discharge and recharge cycles, anybody who's had any kind of a battery knows about this, result in the reduction of the ability to hold a charge over time. So now the battery is not holding much charge anymore, and you need a new battery in order for the vehicle to be functionally useful. Well, are you going to spend $15,000 or $20,000 on a battery for a vehicle that might at that time only be worth $20,000? And the answer is no, of course not. So it's kind of, you talk about planned obsolescence. We've heard that term before. Nothing could be more planned obsolete than this business with these electric cars.
And what is the greater agenda other than selling cars in terms of how these cars limit you? And of course, we know from Edward Snowden and many other whistleblowers that the government has been spying on us nonstop, and we know that they want to impose a digital cashless society so that they know every single move we make and monitor our meat intake and our carbon usage and our carbon footprint. How does that all connect to the automobile?
Well, what they're attempting to do here is to resurrect the dynamic that existed roughly 100 years ago, 120 years ago, when a car was a luxury item. Cars at that time, before the Model T Ford, were for the most part hand-built and custom ordered. You may have watched the BBC series Downton Abbey. Did you watch that?
No,
it featured late Victorian, the family of a British earl in late Victorian England. And the earl had many cars because he was an earl, and his servants drove the cars, but the servants didn't own cars, they walked. So they're attempting to reestablish the distinctions that wealth and privilege once conferred. I think a lot of these people are malignant, and what they're motivated by isn't just greed, isn't just the idea that, oh, I'd like to drive a 6-figure car. That's not enough for them. They don't want you and I to drive a car. That's what they're after ultimately with this. And it's evident, we hear a lot about the climate crisis, right? Which implies that there's an emergency and, we have to take drastic steps to save the planet. Well, then if that's true, how is it that they are allowing these electric cars, which are gratuitous consumers of energy? You hear about ludicrous speed. The chief marketing attribute that you hear with regard to electric cars is how powerful and quick they are. Look, ludicrous speed, it'll get to 60 in 2.9 seconds, which is true, but isn't that wasteful? Isn't that consumptive of resources? Doesn't that use more energy, including electricity, and create more carbon than is absolutely necessary? You'd think that if we truly were in a crisis, as they say, than a minimalist kind of EV, one that was focused on being very efficient. It wouldn't be worried about getting to 60 in 2.9 seconds. As long as it got there in 10 or 11 seconds and got you to where you needed to go, nothing fancy, nothing speedy, that would be what they were after. But they're not after that, are they? What they want is for the very affluent to have cars like the Tesla S Plaid and you and I to take the bus.
I got it. For thee, one thing as opposed to for me. It's kind of like bringing us back to a sort of modern feudalism where the
Exactly.
peasants are at one level and the lords of the manor are at a different level. Now, in terms of the revelations of government spying on its own citizens,
Mhm.
what are the various aspects of the modern cars which make them very dangerous in terms of the freedom, security, privacy of their owners?
Yeah, well, it's interesting that you use the term owner. And the reason I think it's interesting is because in prior days, when you bought a car, it was your car. You bought it, it was an item that you owned. Well, most people don't realize that the data being collected by Airfinger's quotes, their cars, is being extracted without their consent from the car. And it's being used for various purposes, including turning them into a commodity. The data is monetized. One of the great revenue streams now of the car business is your data. They used to make money by selling you a car. Now they're making a lot of money by selling data about you that's collected by the car. People have probably heard the term connected with reference to cars, and that's exactly right. These cars are constantly sending and receiving information, updates that help the manufacturer obtain information about the operating parameters of the car, for example, and not necessarily nefarious stuff. It can help to isolate and diagnose problems with the car. That's fine. But in addition to that, data about your preferences. Remember, you've got essentially a cell phone in the car. If you've been in a new car lately or been in a dealership, there's a cell phone built into the dashboard, a big touch screen. And through that touch screen, you type and swipe the various apps. You want to find a gas station, you're interested in a restaurant, whatever your Bluetooth playlist is that you're piping into the car. All of these pieces of information about you, this data, is being aggregated, collected, and it's being accessed by people without your consent. And really, fundamentally, to me, that's the problem. People aren't aware of the fact that this data mining is going on. And they're not given the option to opt out of it, which they ought to be. In fact, I think it should be opt-in. You should be presented with the choice. Okay, this technology is available. If you're interested in this, here are the pros and cons. We get this benefit, but you'll get this benefit from it as well. If you think that that's a good bargain, then you accept or not. That's what I think this ought to be based on.
What about the dangers, if there are any, you tell us, of the so-called self-driving cars that don't need a driver and self-directed?
Well, there's a lot of dangers. I mean, obviously, if you follow the news, you probably are aware of the fact that there have been a number of accidents involving these things because the technology is fallible. I think we, as a society, have made an error of regarding technology, science, as perfect and omniscient. Well, it's not. It operates within the parameters that it's programmed to operate, and that's it. And it actually is at a deficit relative to the human mind, which can take in unanticipated information that goes outside of a computer program and can then evaluate that very quickly and make a decision. The self-driving technology, if it encounters something that's outside the parameters of its programming, it doesn't know what to do. And also keep in mind that a lot of the technology is dependent upon things like external sensors, for example, cameras that are built into the front and rear end of the vehicle that allow the system to see what's going on. I test drive new cars every week, and I test drive them in the wintertime and in bad weather. And sometimes the ice will cover those cameras, and then you'll get a little pop-up icon on the screen that says whatever the system is temporarily disabled because the camera is obscured. So, it's a mistake to sit back and relax and assume that this technology is perfect. It might not be. And, then you get into the fact of agency. If you or I, if we don't pay attention when we're driving and we cause an accident or we drive the car in a reckless manner, you and I are the ones that are responsible for that. Well, who's responsible when the car drives recklessly and runs somebody over? Who's going to pay for that?
I would assume the manufacturer would get sued, but who knows? Maybe they'll do what they did with the COVID jab and give themselves immunity eventually.
Well, they already have. It's a very interesting catch-22. Again, I've personally driven these vehicles, so I've seen this myself. You get a lawyer screen when you first get in the car, and it says that you understand and agree that you are supposed to maintain full responsibility for operation of the vehicle, and you're supposed to be constantly keeping your eyes on the road and ready to intervene. That's the language that they use, in the event that the system isn't working correctly. But I mean, that places people in an absurd position. On the one hand, you're sold this idea, I don't have to worry about driving. I'm tired. I just want to take a nap. I can just hit the autopilot and the car will take me home. That's the reason that you bought it, right? I mean, if you have to sit in front of the steering wheel with your hands literally ready to go and your feet ready to go on the pedals, then it's really not very useful, is it, to you as a self-driving technology? So, that's the way they get out of it. Like if something goes wrong, then the manufacturer can say, well, we told you that you should have been paying attention, and it's not our fault that the system glitched and ran over the old lady who was walking across the street.
I see. And what about the idea of outsiders being able to take over the control of your car?
Yeah, that's actually a really important consideration because from a technological point of view, that is something that has been enabled. A lot of people don't understand that many of the controls in a car now are wireless. So for example, the throttle, for the first 120 years of the existence of the car, when you push down on the gas pedal, what you're doing is exerting pressure on a physical cable, and the cable would move back and forth like that. And that would cause the throttle arm to tip forward or to tip back. And that is what caused the engine to speed up. Now it's all drive-by-wire. So when you're pushing down on the accelerator, what's happening is that information about that angle of depression is being fed via sensors to a computer that interprets it. And then the computer determines how fast the engine should rev in response. Now, the interesting thing is, in a connected car, all of these systems are accessible and accessible remotely. So if somebody had access to the vehicle and was able to plug into it, so to speak, wirelessly, they could control the throttle. They could cause the car to accelerate if they wish to, out of control. And by the way, it's no longer can you put the transmission into neutral, because the transmission is drive-by-wire too. When you move that gear selector from park to reverse to neutral to drive, all you're doing is moving a sensor position that feeds the information to the computer. So again, if the computer decides to keep you in drive, you're going to keep on driving and potentially right into a bridge abutment. I'm not saying that these things happen. I'm saying that from a technological point of view, they can happen.
Yeah, let's say you're a whistleblower,
Right.
or even as I alluded to, Edward Snowden. And
Yep.
Many politicos said that he should be killed. He's driving his vehicle. Can they just take over the car and run him off a cliff?
Feasibly, I mean, from a technological point of view, that sort of thing is entirely possible, and it goes beyond just the throttle and the transmission. More and more new cars have entirely electrically assisted steering, and the steering is connected to motors. You may have heard of a safety technology called lane keep assist, and what it does is it uses cameras that are embedded in the car to track the vehicle's position in the lane relative to the center line and the shoulder line, the painted lines on the road. And if it senses that you're drifting across the line, it will correct for you. It will actually steer the vehicle. And in autonomous cars, obviously, the car is fully capable of completely steering the car. Well, again, this is electronically controlled. It's computer controlled, and it's part of this wireless connected system. So somebody who had access to that and could control the car could cause a steering wheel to just jerk abruptly and suddenly, maybe causing your car to go off the road into a ditch and killing you. It's entirely possible within the capacity of the technology that is already in the vehicle.
And what about your car as a potential surveillance tool of you in the car and anyone else?
Well, oh yeah, that's a really good question. In addition to the data that's being culled from you about your preferences, about where you've been, about where you're going, about how fast you're getting there, a lot of people have no idea that all new cars, all of them, have microphones built into them and also have cameras, like we were talking about, built into them. So that in addition to the things that people think about in terms of data, They can also record visual things. They can potentially record conversations. A good way to understand this, everybody's familiar with Alexa, Google's Alexa system. You know, you bring this box into your home and you put the thing on the dining room table, and it can listen, and it does listen. And you know, and supposedly it listens even when you've turned it off. And that's how Alexa knows and Amazon knows that you like a particular brand of dog food, let's say. And so then they pitch that brand of dog food to you the next time you're on the computer. That sort of thing now is embedded in new cars.
That's amazing. And you know, I have a car that I have two cars that are more than 20 years old. So I would assume that technology is not in those cars. Am I correct?
You're probably correct about most of it, except for one thing. Are they GM cars?
No, they're Japanese.
Okay, well, you're in luck then. GM began this juggernaut back in the 90s. Do you remember OnStar?
Yeah, sure.
Yep. OnStar came online roughly about, I'm thinking 93, 94, sometime, a long time ago. But that was the first of these connected systems. And essentially, it was meant to offer people an elaboration of you know, AAA roadside service. Instead of, you know, having to walk to a phone to call AAA because you broke down, all you had to do was push the OnStar button and you get the OnStar operator, and the OnStar operator could send out a tow truck, you know, to come help you with your flat tire or your breakdown or whatever it was. So that was the first use of this technology. And it's interesting too that GM didn't put it on the table as an option and give people the opportunity to choose to buy it or not. It was installed, like it or not, in every vehicle that GM sold. Now, you know, eventually you had to pay for a subscription, but the point is GM had that technology put into your car, and it's been in the cars for the past 30 years. And all the other manufacturers saw what GM did and thought, there's potentially a lot of money to be made there. And so they came along with their same systems. And of course, they sold it to people in terms of the convenience. Look at all this helpful stuff that we can do for you through this technology. But you know, they're not altruistic. They're not doing it because, you know, they're your buddy and they care about you. They're doing it because it benefits them.
Yeah, it's kind of a good analogy for that would be when they tell you you should chip your kids so
Right.
kids don't get lost or kidnapped. Well, that sounds great that you're chipping your kids so they don't get lost. But
Isn't that horrible? I mean, we've gotten to a state in this society where we went from chipping animals to being treated like animals, and you know, treating children like animals, chipping your kid as if it were a pet dog or a cat.
yeah, yeah, well, that's what most people have consented to being. That's why they call them the sheeple as opposed to the people.
Yeah,
Is
it's a
there
tragic thing.
what is the solution though for the average person who is stuck in this cesspool or quicksand, and what can he do? He's stuck with having to
Well,
drive a car.
well, I think really profoundly, I think we have got, and I say we, the royal we. I don't mean to be, you know, I guess arrogant about it, because I don't say that everybody is like this, but I think that just in general terms, we should go back to the days when we exercised due diligence. People are thoughtless today. They let themselves be led and told what to do without saying, wait a minute, why should I do that? On what authority are you telling me to do this? You know, it goes back to, you can look at things like the masks and the vaccines and everything that went on during the pandemic. People just lined up and did what they were told, and it was appalling. You know, Americans used to be a questioning people who would ask, well, wait a minute, why should I do that? What's your reasoning for that? You know, convince me, persuade me, present an argument. And if it makes sense, okay, you know, then I'll go along with what you've got to say. But I'm not a trained circus animal. And if you know, you tell me to jump up on the stage and clap my hands and stand on one leg, I'm not going to do it just because you tell me to. So, you know, we should exercise due diligence. We should look into what's happening. You know, what you and I are talking about is getting word out to people about what's going on with cars and so on. But people ought to look into it for themselves too. And then having looked into it, perhaps they ought to say, you know what, this isn't for me. I don't like this, and be vocal about it. And you know, if they're going to go to a car dealership, for example, and look at a car, and they can tell the salesman, you know, I really like this vehicle, and I like everything about it except for this. And I'm not willing to have that in my car. And if you can't take it out, you've lost a sale. I don't want that car. That is a tremendously powerful thing. We saw this demonstrated recently with Bud Light. You know, people feel powerless, but what happened? millions of individual people decided, I really don't like what Bud Light is up to right now, and I'm going to stop buying that beer. I'm just not going to buy it anymore. And collectively, all of those individuals who said, no, I'm not going to do that. You can't make me do it. I'm not going to do it, had a profound effect on Bud Light. And it could have the same profound effect on the car industry and so many other things besides.
Yeah, but other than that, as a practical matter, because what you're talking about, if it ever happened that the American people would grow a brain, if that happened, fine, we could actually turn things around. But in the short term, if you're looking to buy a car, what do you do?
Well, I'm glad you brought that up, because this week there actually is something that's taking place in Washington, our favorite place, in Congress. They're bringing up this business, about autonomous cars and about privacy concerns, about data. And again, it doesn't take too much effort to make your voice heard, to get in touch with whichever your representatives happen to be in Congress, in the House and in the Senate, and let them know that you don't like this, that this is not acceptable. And again, it sounds trite, and I understand the frustration that people have. I feel it myself. What's my call going to matter? Who cares? They're not going to listen to me. Well, if enough of us do that, they will listen. That's what we have to do.
There's no question about that. I used to be the attorney for a senator, and I was just a young kid out of law school, and an irate member of his constituency walked into his office, and he was yelling and screaming and making a whole big deal. And when the guy walked out, I said to the senator, boy, that guy was ticked off. And he said to me, let me teach you something. He's only one person. If one person complains, I couldn't care less. If 100 storm into the office, I start to worry.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And therein lies the problem. But my question is driving at, if you need a car tomorrow, what would you buy?
Mm-hmm. Well, there's a subjective and there's, I guess, an objective answer to that. Subjectively, I would personally not buy one, because I don't want any of this creepy Big Brother stuff in my personal vehicle. I would give consideration to buying an older vehicle that does not have this technology in it. There is an abundance. There are an abundance of vehicles that fit that description that are available. And, in a lot of ways, they're better vehicles in the sense that they're more durable and reliable. Federal regulations and mandates have resulted in even very large vehicles now coming with incredibly small, proportionately to the size of the vehicle, little engines, little four-cylinder engines with turbochargers that are running 20 plus pounds of boost and are struggling desperately to produce the power to move this vehicle for the sake of, on paper, saving 3 or 4 miles per gallon so that the vehicle makes the federal government happy, when the owner would be much better served having a V6 engine without a turbo, that is more understressed and will probably last for 200,000 or more miles before anything goes wrong with it.
So I guess what we want to get home to the people listening is these so-called benefactors of ours in the capitals throughout the United States, who claim that they care about our environment and they care about the animals and the plants, maybe just want us to be slaves while they drive in jets and go off to Davos. Is that a possibility?
Of course, it's a fact. The effrontery of it and the insolence, it's literally right in our faces. We see them. They're not flying coach. They're taking a private jet to Davos, aren't they? Like John Kerry, for example. I doubt very much that Biden is going to exchange the Beast, which is his 8,000-pound armored V8 powered limousine, for an EV. I don't see that happening. Do you? Barack Obama and his wife recently bought a house on Martha's Vineyard that's literally 300 yards away from the supposedly rising ocean. They're apparently not too very concerned about the changing climate, the climate catastrophe. These people, they're the most unctuous of frauds and hypocrites imaginable. And the really interesting thing to me, politically, philosophically, is the inversion. You've got the left now, which at one time posed and postured as the friend of the working man, the average person. And if you go back in the past, they derided, the robber barons, these evil machinators of industry and business who are out to exploit the working man. When in fact, whether they intended to or not, these titans of industry, the John D. Rockefellers and the Henry Fords and all of those people, they elevated the standard of living of the average guy. The average guy got to drive a car because of Henry Ford and the Model T. Whether it was intentional or not, that's the bottom line. And now it is the political left that has become the party of this insufferable elite that wants to reinstate feudalism, as you say, to become the lords of the manor. And we are all supposed to tuck our heads and be obedient little serfs and accept our diminished lot in life. It's a crazy thing.
Yeah, I always point out that, because people don't read anything and don't know anything, they're not aware that when Karl Marx wrote the Bible of Communism, known as the Communist Manifesto, he never once criticized the rich. He only criticized the entrepreneurial middle class, the bourgeoisie. And that's what communism is all about. It's resurrecting feudalism with the lord of the manor in control, and everyone else is just a serf, just breathing air at the pleasure of his master.
They do not want general prosperity, and that is a key to understanding what's going on with regard to cars and mobility. The ability of the average person to just get in a car and go wherever they'd like to, and in particular, to not have to live in the city. To be able to drive from a nice home in the suburbs where they can raise their family in peace with some land and some nice surroundings, as opposed to living in a tiny little apartment where they have to walk or ride a government train or take a government bus to their job. This is something that these communists can't stand because they live on an immiseration and resentment. They want everybody to be full of hate and anger and anxiety because they don't have something. And then the communist presents the answer. Well, you don't have because they have, and we'll help you get what they have. And to create this society that's built on envy and anger.
Makes perfect sense. Well, Eric Peters, thank you so much for being with us. You have enlightened many, and as you probably have been doing for a very long time. For the listeners who'd like to keep in touch with your work, what do you suggest they do?
Well, they can go to my website, easy to find. It's epautos.com. It's the world's best libertarian gearhead site because it's the only libertarian gearhead site.
And anything else, any writings or any blogs or anything of that nature?
Well, that's the preponderance of it. I've also got a book that should be finished fairly soon. It's called Doomed, and it's about good cars gone bad. And what I mean by that is vehicles that weren't bad ideas, but were horribly executed by their respective manufacturers. And I've always been interested in that kind of a thing. It's kind of a Wagnerian tragic opera story. So that should be coming out at some point in the next 6 months or so.
All right. Well, Eric Peters, thank you so much for your generous time and knowledge, and may God bless you.
You bet, Bob. Thank you for having me on.
Take care.